All right. So anyway, um, when you do these notes, what you'll be able to do when you go back to do your write-up is you already have done your notes. So all you really have to do is go back, look at your notes. That'll remind you of the things that you thought were important at the time. Not only, in other words, does it help you prepare to do the class discussion, but if you've kept good notes, you should be able to just go back and expand on those notes and then submit your final written assignment for module 5. It shouldn't be that difficult. Now remember, because we have the entire week of Thanksgiving off, you've got a week to prepare for these things. So the one thing that isn't going to play very well is, hey, I just really didn't have time. Okay, so let me just preempt that and just say, yeah, you did. If you chose to spend that time doing something else, you're an adult. When you sit in a chair, your feet touch the floor, that's okay. You know, most of you can probably legally drive. A couple of you can legally drink. The rest of you illegally drink, except that, as we mentioned before, you don't, because your generation is not a fun generation. You're a serious generation, and that's very sad. However, it's your choice. I mean, again, I can't make you study. I can't make you read. I don't even know that I can make you want to do those things. I can try to stimulate your curiosity a little bit and then guide it. Yeah, that's really all teaching is, isn't it? But it's really up to you in terms of, you know, how much work you want to put into this and how much responsibility you want to take for this assignment. It is up to you. Okay. Now, are there any other questions on, before we do a real brief review, and I'm just going to do a real brief flyover of these theories, and then you'll be able to say, oh no, I didn't know that. I better ask about that. But before I do that, are there other questions on the presentations? Because there's only one other thing I want to add on that. But so far, so good. You know what the notes are for? Yes, you are required to enter notes. Yes, you must do that. If you don't, the world will stop. And we'll have to do the election all over again. And this time there will be widespread fraud. I will see to it because I can. All right? I mean, yeah, chaos is great, man. In chaos, there is opportunity. I love it. You know? I think I like chaos because I have no discipline. I think undisciplined people probably respond better to chaos because they're like, I just improvise. I just wing it. All right. The only thing remaining for us to decide, and we can do this, is shall we just go in the order in which they're listed in terms of presentations? When we come in on the 30th, which is a Monday, right? Should we just start with terrorism, the notion of to what degree is terrorism global or local, and then just work our way through the list? Is there anybody who would have a problem with that? Because I want you to know kind of when you're going to be expected to go. I would imagine that if we do this right, we should be able to do 2 or 3 in one class and then do the other 2 or 3 in the Wednesday class, and then we're pretty much done. If we have to carry it over into that into that week of whatever it is, I don't know, the 7th through the 11th, the last week, we could. I don't think we will have to, though. So I would say that if you're doing either the terrorism, global or local, climate change, or international governance, you should be ready to go on Monday the 30th. Okay, we won't do more than that because we just won't have time. If you're going to be doing globalization and gender equality, or globalization and culture, and this thing about pop culture, all right, you're not going to be expected to go before Wednesday. All right. Now, the other thing is there still are a couple of people, I think only a couple, and I'm not sure if any of them are in class today. I don't have the list up in front of me, who haven't yet requested anything. Remember, the later you request, the lousier the seating is. You're less likely to get your first choice. What I'm trying to do is get as close as we can to groups of 3 or 4 on these things. And let me see. I think, yeah, so far for terrorism, I have 3 people. For climate change, I have 4. For the global health thing, what are we calling that? International governance and global health pandemics. There's 3 people so far. 3 people on gender equality, and that's probably enough. And 3 people. The only thing that worries me a little bit about gender equality, I don't know. I don't know if we're really serving ourselves in terms of our scholarship by having no men in that group. But I also don't want to get more than 3 on that. I'm trying as much as I can not to get more than 3. And then we have 3 people for the pop culture thing. Okay. But I am still waiting to hear from a couple of you. I think the hardcore of this class is about 17 people who actually show up and do work, even though I think there are a few people still floating around enrolled. All right, so then I would say make a note. And this is recorded, so if you space out on when you're liable to go, you can always have to, you have to listen to this again, and what fun that will be. But if you haven't yet emailed me with a request, or in at least one case, if I say, hey, we're kind of overbuilt on some of these, how about one of these other ones? That means you haven't been yet assigned a topic for presentation. That means you have to, because you are required to do it if you really want to pass the class. Remember, I said at the beginning in class, you have to at least attempt every assignment. Okay, you don't have to pass every assignment, but you have to attempt every assignment. And not doing one and taking an F is not the same thing as attempting it. Okay. And also, I mean, you got to learn to do this stuff. It's why I only do it once at the end of a class. It's an intro class, and usually in intro classes, people don't want to talk very much. You don't have to talk all that much, but you just have to be able to answer questions. A lot of it might work that way. It might have somebody, maybe one person in your group might give an overview or a summary. If they've left anything out, somebody else in the group can fill it in, and then we can start asking questions. And I mean we, not just me, because I can get very prosecutorial on that, as you know, and I don't mean to. It's just that it's my job. Now, I guess that probably is all we really need to know about that for now.
I have a quick question for the presentation.
Yeah.
Just a clarifying question. So is this supposed to be a succinct group presentation, i.e. reaching out to the people in our group and figuring a presentation together, or is this going to be more so individual, one person starts with what they got and then people fill in the gaps after that within the group?
Well, I would prefer that you use the genius of smart technology and integrate with members of your group. And I'm going to post a final listing of that as soon as I hear from people. In fact, I may just have to do it now. But what I thought we could do, again, some people find this really tedious, some people find it helpful. There's a group function in Zoom that allows me to assign kind of virtual rooms where you could go as a group and meet. Okay, it's a little clunky, but it isn't, we could put you in there for 10 minutes or something, or 5 minutes, or however long you think you need. And then you could kind of compare notes and everything before you do your presentation. But remember, I don't want you to feel like this is some really big, weighty kind of presentation where you have to have a PowerPoint and do screen share and all that. I want at least to have 3 or 4 people who can discuss informatively a given assigned reading. Okay, so you could conceivably all do this independently, but it would be better if you had the opportunity to coordinate. I don't really like the idea of compelling you to do work outside of class. I'm just not comfortable with that. I don't think it's a bad idea, but I don't like requiring it. But one way for us to get around that would be, when we come in on Monday the 30th, we could take, say, the first, 10 minutes of class. We could create some discussion rooms for the people who are definitely going to present that day, maybe for the first 3 groups, and then give them a few minutes. In the meantime, we can kibitz a little bit and hang out and, smoke a Fugatum. And then you can come back from those groups and then you kind of know what each other's going to say. We could do it that way. What do you think? How do you want to do it? Micah, not just you, but the class.
I kind of like that idea that you described, because if everybody is on the same page and has done, read through the article and has done their job, it's going to be pretty easy to form okay, you're doing this, or we're doing those.
Okay. Anything else? I have one concern about any kind of group activity, and it is the free rider problem. Okay, where you get somebody who thinks, well, You know, I don't really have to do very much here. In fact, you know what? I don't even really have to read this thing. Because if Bill's going to let us meet as a group, all I have to do there is sit there, listen, take some notes, and then I can mention those things. I mean, people will do that. So that's the only downside of not just kind of working as an individual until you get there on the day. Okay. So now, what about that? Should I be concerned about that? About the free rider problem? In other words, you're going to be doing somebody else's work, whether you like it or not. That's the concern I have. And it usually does happen at least once, including, by the way, in upper division classes. It just never seems to stop. It must be sort of the American way. Well, if I can get this thing done without doing any work, by golly, I'm going to do that. I don't know. What does it matter with us as a people that we would do that? Cassidy's all disgusted. See, I can't tell if you're disgusted with America or if you're disgusted with me. You know? So maybe it's the same thing. It's your fault. You're old. You did.
I'm mostly America, but I think your comments are really funny, so I just like laugh to myself and my cats.
Well, I'm clearly here to amuse you. I like having a good time. Should I apologize for that? Gee whiz, man. You know, it's the only fun you can have in a pandemic, man. Get on Zoom and make an ass of yourself. I do that in front of faculty on a regular basis. It horrifies them. I think I told you that I was asked, you know, they do this sort of schmoozy thing. Did I tell you about this? Where they're like, okay, and we're on Zoom. And I just hate that whole group mentality. Give us your favorite beverage. And I said morphine. And, you know, it was like, well, what do you want from me? You asked, right? You know, you gotta live a little. Anyway, all these clever, you know, in quotes, liberal PhDs, you know, they were not amused. I'm a bit of a pariah on this campus, and I'm kind of happy about it, I have to say, after all these years, you know. When you can teach for a place going on 26 years and most people walking that campus don't know who you are, you've done something special, you know. So that's kind of cool. And I just realized I've recorded this. So, you know, I'm clearly not going to be here next year. I may not be here next term the way things are going. No, that's not true. That's not funny. Well, it's funny, but only for me. All right. So that's my concern that, you know, I'm concerned about it because most of the people who are here today, most of you have worked really hard in this class. You've applied yourselves. You've done solid sort of A to B work, clearly above average. Many of you who are here have had really interesting insights that you've offered to class and everything. And I don't think it's fair, unless you're not concerned about it, that other students will exploit that and think, you know what, I'll let them do my work for me. You know, so that's my only concern with using the breakout rooms. Should I be concerned about that, or should we just do it anyway? What do you think?
I think people are going to do it. Like if people are going to do it, breakout rooms aren't going to help or make things worse. I think if people are going to do it, they're going to do it no matter what. So.
Well, it's going to make it easier for them to do it in a breakout room because, you know, they can just sort of agree with what everyone's. I see people do this all the time, you know. But again, if you're not that, sorry, go ahead, Micah.
I was just gonna say, I'd rather have a succinct, like more professional, like more fluid presentation and have somebody like piggyback than to have somebody not know it and then the presentation just seem like super negative because you have one person that just looks like a fool.
Yeah, so would I. It's just that I don't know how concerned you are about doing other people's work for them. If you don't think that's a significant enough problem, because I think there is an advantage, there's a value in those breakout rooms and giving you a chance to meet for, I don't think it would take more than 10 minutes, right? For you to sit there, compare notes, and then, as you say, as Michael was suggesting, have a more sort of kind of seamless, fluid, coherent presentation and all that. Because, you know, every individual is still going to have to write something. And somebody who isn't applying themselves to the presentation probably is going to write something that's not very good, you know, if they're not doing the work. The other thing is, keep in mind, those of you who are thinking of free writing, I'm going to be looking at your notes. What do you think you're gaining? I'll know you blew it off because I'll see, oh, wait a minute, you're going to present on this. There's nothing in your notes. By the way, There is no excuse. I don't care if you write things in a doc file, everything else, just cut and paste it and drop it in there. You are required to do that as part of the assignment, okay? It is a way for me to lower the likelihood of someone free writing, but also you're going to get more value out of the assignment, okay? I hate to get into this kind of, weird pedagogy stuff instead of talking about the substance of the class, but we're almost done, and yet that we still do have some people who are sort of chronic abusers of the privilege. So for those of you who are, I'm trying to make it a little more difficult for you so that maybe you'll take a little more of a challenge in the class now. Micah, did you have your hand up? Or were you just adjusting your cap there? Okay, you just flashing signals. Okay, all right. Okay. So again, it's at the bottom of the Moodle page. It says Module 5 presentation notes. And you can go in there more than once. It can be, you can have a sentence here, a sentence there, just as long as by Monday, I can see you've pretty well summarized the article. And again, summarize. You can do it as an outline. It's not a written assignment in the sense that it has to be an essay. Do it the way you would normally take notes on something that you're reading. Because the purpose of notes, remember, is it's just for you. It's to remind you as you go through things, oh, that's right, this is important. If I don't write this down, I'm not going to know where I found this and I'm going to forget it. I have to do that all the time. I mean, I'm looking at a stack of like 30 books over there. That's my Christmas break reading. I can't read all that stuff without taking notes. I can't. I'll forget. Because I'll read them and I'll go from, I don't know how many of you do this. I'll get one book, I'll read, 20 pages of that, and that's pretty good. And then I'll get another one. After I've read about 10 books, I sometimes can't remember now, where was that cool thing that scholar said about, Nigeria? I better go look for that, Apropos Nigeria, by the way, there's an interesting phenomenon over there in that they're having a lot of demonstrations in Nigeria that look strikingly like Black Lives Matter protests. In other words, this is a place that has a long history of military dictatorship and really oppressive governments, with a former military dictator as its elected president, who has a long pedigree of being very reactionary politically, right? And so they kind of dropped the hammer on public demonstrations. There have been these demonstrations in Nigeria over brutality by the police and the military. While the military and then the police have since, as far as we can tell, turned their guns on these people. So something to watch there. If Nigeria explodes, okay, it's going to be important. And this is globalization. This is a lot of the stuff we talked about. You might think, well, Nigeria, who cares, right? They're a major oil supplier. They contribute to the world oil supply. So if the flow of oil is interrupted from Nigeria, your gas prices are going to go up. It has to do with commodity speculation, but which you'll get into in things probably like the International Studies 320 class in the major, which is Brett Anderson's International Political Economy class, which is really fascinating stuff. But that's one to keep an eye on. Another one is still on the same continent. The TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which was one of the key insurgent groups in the overthrow of Mengistu's sort of fascist regime in Ethiopia and the installation of democratic institutions in both Ethiopia and Eritrea, right? They're kind of on the move again against Ethiopia. This is interesting because the current prime minister of Ethiopia recently won the Nobel Peace Prize for ending another wave of armed conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Okay, and now he's being accused by some of these really brutal, violent crackdowns on Ethiopian citizens in the Tigray region. So again, that can destabilize the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa is the Red Sea. The Red Sea is an important trade route, globalization. So see, you have these kind of obscure little things that don't show up in the news or anything like that. And then suddenly gas prices go up, or suddenly, commodity prices go up, or something happens, that's a little jolt to the capitalist system, right? So it's interesting to kind of keep an eye on these things, both in Ethiopia and in Nigeria. And that's just two countries in one continent. And this kind of stuff is happening all over the place. I think that arguably the greater concern would probably right now be Yemen, because that is getting increasingly violent. And the Trump administration has just officially labeled the Houthi a terrorist organization, which is not terribly accurate. They are, I would argue, technically an insurgency that has used occasionally terrorist tactics, but so have both sides in the military, you know. So it's, you know, these kinds of things, though, are the reason why administrations can succeed or fail. They're the reason why, I mean, you think about an obscure place like Benghazi, and most of you never even knew where Benghazi was. The next thing you know, here's Hillary Clinton having to go and testify before the Senate, of which she was formerly a member, as now Secretary of State, about how things were butchered and Americans died. And it wasn't very many Americans, and it might not have been prevented, but she's remembered primarily for the statement, "What difference does it make?" You know, which is something no Secretary of State should ever say in public anyway. But see, you know, these little areas that you don't think much about can become very important to, you know, your experience just staying inside the United States. Now, if you are in the military, or you're aspiring to do that, or you're aspiring to work in, you know, the Foreign Service or something like that, you could very well end up working in one of these areas. And you should begin to think about tracking these things. That's the value of, this is really the only major on campus that we offer that encourages and helps you to do that and kind of keep an eye on the world. I think that's arguably, from my point of view, that's the purpose of international studies. Is it makes you a better world watcher. The world makes more sense to you. All right, now, in terms of that was meant to be a segue into our discussions of, you know, theories of international relations. Geopolitical realism. Any of the things you do, but let's just take realism. If you're going to use that as one of the models or theories that you're going to be comparing one with another, the way to do that is to identify the basic assumptions of it. And you can summarize geopolitical realism really quickly. Fundamental assumptions are an environment characterized by perpetual conflict. Conflict is inevitable and it's natural because the international environment is anarchic. There's no real law. Nobody's running the show in any formal or reliable way. In that environment, the key decisions are made by states as unitary rational actors. Okay, that's realism in sort of capsule form. Okay, are there questions about that, about what any of that means? Because I want to make sure that I'm clear about this.
I have a quick, small clarifying question. Geopolitical realism, would that be more closely associated with structural or classical realism? Or is it its own branch?
Reframe the question you're asking, because depending on what you mean that question to mean, I'm going to answer it more than one way.
So if you're looking at structural realism and classical realism, which term does geopolitical realism more apply to, or is it its own train of thought?
It would be classical realism. It would be the notion of that notion of international politics largely derived from the assumptions of Machiavelli, for example. Okay. I'm not sure that structural realism is functionally distinct from that, depending on how it's applied, but it can be. That's the problem. That's why I kind of avoided that, you know.
Yeah, it's just minute differences, you know.
Yeah.
It's definitely not big differences from, you know, liberalism and realism. I was just, you know, the small.
No, you're right. You're right. Now, again, if you were to take Dustin Walcher's IS 350 class, that would be the upper division course in which you'd go much more deeply into these theories of international relations. And then with Dustin, you would explore those nuances that Mike is talking about. Okay. But here, I try to just give you an introduction, kind of an overview of these theories. Those distinctions are perfectly relevant when you know what they mean. If you don't really understand the implications of those nuances, they can be really confusing. Okay. And so it's a perfectly legitimate question. It's the kind of question that will be much more easily answered at the upper division level. I'm not dodging out. I'm just saying, especially since this is a review, I'm always reluctant to inject new information into a review. But it's a perfectly legitimate question. Beyond that, anything else on the notion of states as a unitary rational actor? By the way, given what we've talked about, okay, we have a definition for the state that we've talked about. So that I want to know that you know what I mean when I say the state. So when I say the state, what am I talking about? This is taking you back a module. If you don't remember, you don't remember, because this is all new information. I understand that. It has to do with institutions, not people. The formal
It is
definition.
more or less the government.
Well, the government technically is the people who inhabit the state, who inhabit
Okay,
the
fair,
institutions. But it is what we would call the government.
I-
Americans are funny in that we always do this differently. But yeah, I'm sorry. Kennedy, did you start to say something?
I did. I was just interrupting you. How rude of me. But I found I wrote it down. What is a state? So the nexus of authoritative institutions exerting control over a given people living in a legally bounded territory.
That is just a super brilliant definition, which of course I came up with. But I didn't, because it's 40 years of studying this crap. But thank you. Yeah, that's what it is. In other words, if you take the institutions, the authoritative institutions, by that what I mean, the institutions that are used to make binding decisions in the name of that territory. In other words, in the United States, the state would be constructed of, among other things, the three branches of government. But it would be, for our purposes, primarily the executive branch. Because in foreign policy, there's very little, not none, but very little actual restriction on what the executive branch can do. Okay. The War Powers Act is often misunderstood as being a way of preventing presidents from fighting undeclared wars. It's not. And it has not done anything to stop that. It's arguable that that really wasn't even its intent. And if it was so diluted that it didn't happen. But, you know, the House has essentially no authority other than its budgetary authority to stop a military adventure. The Senate, pretty much the same thing. The Senate has advice and consent authority on who becomes the Secretary of State, but not the National Security Advisor, right? When presidents make decisions about deploying armed power, they generally make those with the National Security Advisor. That's someone who serves at the pleasure of the president, and that's a position that does not require Senate confirmation. The reason why I mention that is it's one other way in which an executive branch can become really powerful in foreign affairs, right? Without any check on its authority. There's very little that, you know, the House or the Senate, much less the courts, can do. Courts almost never intervene in foreign policy. And the American people have next to no influence over foreign policy, okay? So that's why I say the state is a unitary rational actor. Now, again, it's obviously an oversimplification. You can, and we do have, conflicts within a given state. I think I mentioned before that one example of that would be in Jimmy Carter's administration, the conflict between the Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, and the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, right? They looked at the world in very different ways. One of them was a regionalist, you know, sort of, liberal internationalist, and the other one was, they just conflicted, you know. So you had this realist, and then you had this liberal internationalist, regionalist, and they were always in conflict. Okay. But ultimately, out of that conflict, a decision is taken. That's all that realism is concerned with. Explaining, okay, never mind what the argument was. What was the ultimate decision taken by the state? Go to war, negotiate. Enter into a trade agreement, ignore it, right? Enter into a military alliance, withdraw from it, okay? It doesn't matter what the other options were, as long as you can understand, okay, there was a logic or a rationale that presumed to be in the interest of the state. So that's where you get this idea of the state, that is the institutions and those who control them, as a unitary rational actor, ultimately having to act in concert to produce an outcome. Okay, it is an oversimplification. Every theory is. Okay, it's what's called theoretical elegance. Elegance means simplicity, really. Have as few moving parts as possible. One of the assumptions about theory building is the simpler the theory, if it's a good explanation and it's simple, it's stronger, right? Because you don't have to make all kinds of qualifying additions to or deletions from the theory in order to apply it. That's what people mean when they say either theoretical or conceptual elegance. It's like, wow, it's just beautifully simple. Okay, realism is beautifully simple in the sense of that construct. Okay, what about world systems theory? What would be the fundamental assumptions of world systems theory? Now, again, they don't have to be completely different or even inconsistent with realism. They might be, depending on how you argue it, but they don't have to be. What are the basic assumptions? What's the world system, first of all? You'd have to know that. What is the system in which the world operates according to world systems theory?
Capitalism.
Capitalism, global capitalism. Yeah. Now remember, you know, we can argue against these theories, but before we do that, we got to understand what the theory purports to say, to show us. So the first thing about world systems theory is that the world is not completely anarchic. There is a rationale to the environment, and it is the imperative of capitalism. What is the imperative of capitalism? What must actors in capitalism do in order to survive and thrive in capitalism? What do you have to do? By nature of the system of capitalism, what gives you power?
Exploitation.
Well, exploitation is the mechanism you use in order to accomplish this thing. Why do you exploit in capitalism? In order to do what? What's the end game? This is a simpler question than I think many of you are thinking. I think you're overthinking it. Capitalism.
To make money.
Not just make money, make profit, accumulate wealth. Yeah. In other words, you can make money, but not very much, right? But you can make a steady stream of money. Think about people who run small businesses. If you run a restaurant, for example, most restaurants run on what's called a very narrow margin. That's why this COVID situation is really hurting local bars and restaurants and stuff, because they run on these really narrow margins, meaning their profit margin is tiny. You know, presenting food and drinks to people in a way that they enjoy it is incredibly expensive. Okay. And the profit margins are low. Okay. But what we're talking about with the world system is essentially these capitalist powers trying to enhance their leverage in this system by accumulating more wealth, because wealth is the throw weight of capitalism. Okay. Because wealth you can't just build a big army. You've got to pay for it. All right. You either have to develop the industrial infrastructure to build your own weapon systems, or you have to be able to go out and buy them from someone, and they're expensive. Okay. And so the logic of the world systems theory is that there is an organizing principle in the world. It is world capitalism. Now, as Kennedy suggested, it compels powers to attempt, at least, to exploit one another, and particularly for the core countries, right? The major industrialized countries, to exploit what are called the peripheral countries, right? Remember that notion of the core and the periphery? The core countries would be the developed countries that are at the core of capitalism, right? The ones most profitable, most powerful. And the periphery would be recently colonized territories who've just been decolonized within, say, the last century. We sometimes refer to as developing countries or least developed countries or whatever they are, right? And the logic of world systems is, with respect to development particularly, that the peripheral countries are peripheral because they can't develop normally. The core won't allow it. This is theory, right? So then you get a thing called underdevelopment. Okay, that is, not only are you not developing, you're underdeveloped, meaning what might be normal development for you, however long it would take, you know, whatever, you don't have any option over that. You no longer control your own economic and political destiny. That is controlled by the exploiter, by the core. Okay, it's a very and very much a counter-capitalist or anti-capitalist perspective most of the time. It's generally been advanced by scholars trying to explain underdevelopment, trying to explain, you know, sort of the downside of global capitalism, trying to apply essentially, you know, this post-Marxist notion of the accumulation of wealth as an exercise in exploitation to the entire world system. And that system really begins in about the 16th century. Okay. That's when we start the voyages, so-called voyages of discovery and stuff like that. Okay. That one sounds like it's got a lot more moving parts to it. I would say the fundamental assumption of world systems is the world is characterized by a unitary economic system, global capitalism. And it has been since the 15th, let's say the 16th century, okay? Yeah, you know, the Soviet Union tried another model. It lasted 70 years and it was inefficient and it failed miserably, okay? China has a variant of that, but China has really, you know, the world systems theorists would say China has joined the core by becoming more capitalist. China's explosion came when it began to adopt capitalist economic policies, and especially after the massive infusion of capital when it reacquired Hong Kong to the extent that it has, right? So that even China, this allegedly communist monolith, has begun to integrate itself more powerfully into this global system because it's become more capitalist. Okay? So again, it would be, there is a system, it's not chaotic, it's you know, it's unstable sometimes, but it's not chaotic and it's not anarchic. It's dominated by core countries. Okay? And it is capitalism. Okay? And it is premised on the idea of the core exploiting the periphery. Now, we've already talked about what some of the problems with that are. You know, in other words, there have been countries that used to be peripheral countries that now arguably are closer to the core. South Korea is a great example of that. Hong Kong itself might be an example of that, depending on how you look at it. Singapore has been used as an example, and so on. There are countries that clearly once were part of the core, Spain and Portugal, that now, while they aren't completely peripheral, certainly are not powerful countries anymore. I don't care if you remember that right now. Again, it's the kind of discussion you would go into in much more depth if you took my 355 class, which is in international development, where we talk about colonialism and, you know, different models of development and stuff like that, one of which is world systems. Or again, it might come up in Dustin's 350 class. But the main things to remember for our purposes, right, would be the world system is global capitalism characterized by a small but powerful core of completely capitalist nations dominating a periphery of underdeveloped nations that are never going to be allowed into the core. They're never going to become prominent in capitalism. Right? Even China would be notable because China was never really colonized, you know, and most of the periphery is the colonial world. In terms of the theorists who advance the theory. Now I realize it's a little bit complicated, especially if you don't understand your Marx and things like that, and that's okay. But are there questions about that where I might be able to clarify it even more? Some of you, that might be a policy or a model you just want to stay away from because it does have some nuances to it. That would be okay. What about the clash of civilizations? What's the basic assumption there? First of all, when we're talking about civilization, what are we talking about? And why would civilizations clash? Remember that a lot of this relates back to the things that we talked about in Module 3. Those concepts from Module 3, the notion of cultural nationalism, multiculturalism, the global system of nation states, what a culture is, all of those things can be applied to make sense of some or all of these theories. So when Samuel Huntington talks about a clash of civilizations, remember, he gives us these, depending on how you count them, either 7 or 8 distinct cultures, okay? What we're looking at is what defines a culture? What does he mean by a culture? Again, he's not completely clear about that, and it's one of the failings of, insofar as this is a theory rather than a description of the world, it's not really clear. What he's saying is there are these ways of life, okay? Not lifestyles, ways of life. Fundamental principles of values of what's right and what's wrong, what people should aspire to and what they should not, whether or not they are, the degree to which they are materialist or anti-materialist, whatever it is, the importance or lack of importance of religion, whatever it is, okay? These are those civilizations that Huntington's talking about. And his basic argument is that simple realism could kind of explain the world up until the end of the Cold War. Because prior to the Cold War, you know, the struggles were over between the sovereign nation states and their expanding power. Prior to that, dueling monarchies and things like that. The Cold War subsumed all that into this global ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, okay? Or some people would say it wasn't capitalism, it was democracy. It wasn't. It was capitalism and communism, okay? We know that because we know of the frequency with which major capitalist countries, like the capitalist hegemon, the United States, would actually support anti-democratic regimes, regimes that openly and actively crushed democratic participation in order to preserve, you know, capitalism, okay? So that was an ideological struggle. It ended with the demise of the Soviet Union. So then the idea is, well, what comes after that? And what Huntington's arguing is we didn't go back to dueling sovereign nation states. We didn't go back to dueling monarchs because you don't have very many of them anymore. Now what's revealed after you take away, you know, this sort of ideological bipolarity of communism, capitalism, and that's gone, he argues, right? What you're left with are these really basic notions of what life is supposed to be like and the ways that people should live. And, you know, these are their civilizations. And again, there's a map in the Wikipedia entry that I gave you that breaks those down. And what he's essentially arguing is that it's not necessarily states as unitary rational actors. It's states as part of one of these civilizations, acting on behalf of the civilization, acting to advance the interests and values of that civilization, rather than merely their own individual values as sovereign nation states, okay? Do you see how that's somewhat different from realism? Because it doesn't assume that states are unitary rational actors. It assumes that they are aligned with one of these civilizations with almost no exceptions. Okay? That is a theory that confuses a lot of people, including people in the discipline, many of whom think it's garbage. But it's prominent. Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations is one of the most commonly cited references in international relations, okay, to this day. And the theory is, in many cases, been widely rejected, but it's still taught because it tells us something about how we have to think about the world after that era of communist capitalist, you know, bipolarity, the Cold War, what's left, okay? So then the question is, you know, does it explain things like terrorism? Huntington said, yeah, it did. Because terrorism, he argued, was driven overwhelmingly by the Islamic civilization. You know, the idea of having a pan-Islamic caliphate or something like that. Now, one of the things you're going to see when we go into terrorism, though, is that's kind of weird because most terrorism isn't genuinely international. And most of it isn't really advancing a civilization beyond certain borders. You know, despite Islamic State, you know, they weren't really doing much outside of the Islamic world. You know, they weren't being anything more than a really violent inconvenience. Where they were most dangerous was in the Middle East and South Asia. Okay. All right, so that's Clash of Civilizations. Again, it's very subtle. Some of you might just not be comfortable with it. The one you might be comfortable with is liberal internationalism, in terms of contrasting that with realism. So what are the basic principles of liberal internationalism? Remember, this is review. Why is it called liberal internationalism? What's liberal about it?
It at least from the article, it was saying, you know, the aims of it are like expanding democratic practices, free trade, and like promoting human rights and stuff like that.
Yeah, so in other words, it's called liberal internationalism because it's advancing liberal principles. The assumption of liberal internationalism is this isn't anarchic. These people who advance liberal internationalism are unified by the values they share. In other words, it's the idea is the purpose of foreign policy pursued in this way is not simply to prevail as a unitary rational nation state. It's to advance values that are liberal in nature. That is, values that characterize the potential to improve the human experience, to improve the way people live. So there's a consensus within liberal internationalism on what the good values are, and they involve human rights and democracy, okay? And along with that, of course, things like tolerance, right? That, in other words, this is a view of international relations that rejects the realist notion of pretty much intrinsic and perpetual conflict. That, you know, whereas realism accepts the inevitability of conflict up to and including war, liberal internationalism rejects that and says, no, to the extent that we encounter war, it's because we failed. It's because we abandoned principles somewhere. Someone was put themselves, in a Lockean sense, in a state of war against these values, okay? We weren't able to persuade them that these values are better. But remember, the assumption of liberal internationalism is these are universally valued things, that human rights are universally valued. Democracy, you know, some form of you know, widespread participation is universally valued. This very idealistic notion that, no, this is what human beings want. Human beings want to be secure in their lives, liberty, and property. Human beings want to participate. Human beings do not want war, right? This is liberal internationalism. Now, that one you should be able to see pretty clearly is pretty much the opposite of realism. So that's probably the most obvious contrast that you can make. I expect I'm going to get, and that's fine. I expect that I will get a lot of assignments that are drawing those sharp contrasts between realism and liberal internationalism. That makes perfect sense because that is one of the fundamental conflicts in foreign policy. To what extent do we really believe that conflict up to and including war is not inevitable? You know, that's what separates people in terms of different presidential administrations or different people within those administrations. They have some variation of that philosophy. It's sort of a sliding scale from liberal internationalism, the extreme form of which would be some sort of idealism on one end, all the way out to the other end, which is this hardcore realism. War is inevitable. Just make sure you can prevail. The idea of peace through strength, right? Keep peace by preparing for war. That's a bedrock realist principle, completely rejected by liberal internationalists, who would say, if you prepare for war, you will instigate war. Okay? Does that make sense? Again, it isn't a question of whether or not you agree with these things. The main thing is understand how these people think, because they're the ones who make these decisions for you, and they think this way. That's the point. Tristan, were you getting ready to say something? I saw your screen.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question. Does the disinclination towards war with the liberal democracies thing that liberal internationalism set out, does that still hold once states have moved away from conscription armies as much?
Yes.
It does? Okay.
Yeah, it does.
Even though the barrier to, or the cost of war on the average person is significantly less?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because again, the idea, it's not just a cost-effective thing. It's not a way of thriving in a capitalist environment. It is a fundamental norm. It's kind of like human rights. I mean, human rights are expensive. If you think about it, human rights are really expensive, and human rights can be really inconvenient. Human rights can compel people to go to war. Human rights can compel people to mobilize and say, if you don't stop doing that, we're going to come over there and make you stop. Okay. Liberal internationalists don't want to do that, but they have this unifying principle in the ultimate sort of sanctity of human rights. Part of human rights is don't fight wars. Do everything you can to avoid them. Even if those wars might not cost you that much, you're violating this fundamental principle of human dignity, human rights. It's about humanity rather than power.
I was meaning in more of a descriptive sense as opposed to prescriptive.
No, but I am too. Yeah, what I'm saying is that a thoroughgoing liberal internationalist is going to just reject war as an inevitable premise. They're going to say, no, that's when, that's a failure of diplomacy. So most liberal internationalism is heavily leveraged on what in international relations is called soft power. That is, we're going to persuade you by the example of our success, for example. Our large and diverse economy, the living standards of our people, the great movies and television we make, whatever it is. We've got all these cool things that your people want. This too can be yours. We can do that without going to war. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, one of the ideas of moving away from conscription is the notion of conscription is you are essentially retaining the preparation for war. You are inculcating war as an inevitability in your own society by imposing a draft or something like that. And again, we can argue about whether or not that's legitimate. That's not really, it's like saying that everyone who joins the military wants to go kill people or wants to go to war. There are plenty of reasons to join the military or be involved in, national security or something like that, that could be informed by a kind of liberal internationalism. It's striking, for example, how often you will hear really prominent military leaders in the United States who are very reluctant to commit the United States to war. Who will say again and again and again, look, there's plenty more we can do here with respect to diplomacy. And these are the generals who make the decisions. These are the admirals who deploy the Navy. These are the big people who make the big decisions. And a lot of them, because of a combination of their experience, their education, and their training, do develop values, despite the fact that they're situated in and around the Pentagon. They develop these values that are fundamentally liberal internationalists. The argument for that is they know war. They're not chicken hawks like, the mean people in the legislature who say, well, we'll just go blow you up. Yeah, I understand you also avoided the draft when or you didn't serve in the military. You don't mind sending young men and women to fight. You just never wanted to do it yourself. Well, the people in the military are informed by that, and they're offended by it. When some civilian with little or no real experience of any kind, either in uniform or even in terms of strategy, will say, oh, well, we'll just start rattling the saber. So that's where you find a lot of the people on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not all of them, but a lot of them are these kind of reluctant warriors. They understand the costs of war in a way that those who haven't experienced it don't. And by the way, particularly in the United States, most career military people don't want a draft. They don't want to see it because their argument is, you know what? We want volunteers because we want the people who want to be here. We want the people who have chosen this. We don't want people who don't want to be here because we've got to break all that down before we can do anything with them. That was the problem in Vietnam. There were a bunch of us who just wanted to listen to Jimi Hendrix and explore in various ways. And what we didn't want to do is go to Southeast Asia and kill people. I know I didn't want to, I didn't think that was very fun, right? So liberal internationalism would be that. See, the reason why middle-class America rejected the war in Vietnam is because Americans don't want to fight. They don't want to go to war. They want to let the diplomats sort it out. We're seeing that now. Donald Trump has just announced that he's going to make these really significant drawdowns in the military footprint in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And he's going to do it by the time he leaves office. That's the plan. It was just announced by his sort of interim defense secretary, who replaced Mark Esper. And the drawdown is going to be to 2,500 troops. That's what I've heard. I don't know if any of you have heard differently. Okay. Trump came into office saying he was going to do that. You know, whatever you may think about Donald Trump, I mean, one of the things that he said that really resonates with a lot of middle America is get us out of these foreign wars. That we don't belong there. I mean, yeah, we can use our intelligence apparatus and, you know, we can use trade and things like that to pressure people. And we can do, you know, trade war with China. That's one thing. That's a war, but it's a trade war. We're not talking about taking young American men and women, sending them off to these parts of the world, and then, you know, maybe losing them. You know, even though, I mean, we've been relatively fortunate in the fact that we've been in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years. And, you know, arguably, I think, you know, I think the killed in action figure for Americans is about 5,500 to 6,000. Now that's 5,500 to 6,000 too many, but remember that in Vietnam, all right, it was 58,000, most of that between 1965 and 1973, which is a much shorter period of time. So that's the idea. American people want to avoid that. That's what liberal internationalism would say. Your people don't want to fight this war. Don't get them into it. Negotiate this. There's got to be a way we can settle this. We can do better. That fundamental liberal notion of the perfectibility of human beings. Does that make sense? Again, not do you agree with it? Does it make sense? And do you see how that's very distinct from realism? Very distinct. Okay. Idealism I just put in there to show you how difficult it is to apply idealism to anything. I just thought it was an interesting read. Don't worry about it. If it didn't resonate with you and you don't know where to put it, then it, you know, that's okay. Sometimes I put something in and it doesn't strike sparks. Okay. Now, are you clear on what the assignment is? Okay, I'll read it to you for those of you who don't have access to Moodle. In a concise, well-crafted essay, and I do mean both concise and well-crafted. Give me your best writing. No more of this first draft stuff, okay? 2 to 3 paragraphs. You can do this in 2 to 3 paragraphs, 2 to 3 pages, 2 to 3 paragraphs, okay? Contrast any 2 of the models of international relations studied in Module 4. Be sure to identify the basic assumptions of each model and explain clearly what separates one from another, okay? So I would recommend that before you even begin the assignment, you make a call. Which 2 of these theories do I understand the best? And then you focus on those. Break them down to their core principles. And again, it's a hassle to do, but if you wanted to, you could go back and listen to the lectures when we discuss them. You have to sit through everything else we did, but also, you know, presumably you took some notes somewhere and you've got the articles right in front of you. So it shouldn't be that difficult to do. Especially, of course, if you're contrasting something like liberal internationalism with realism. All right, so any questions? Because that was really all I had on tap for today, is just to review. Let me just get a sense, because I'm getting that kind of weird stony silence that I get that often indicates that people are thinking, I have no idea what he's talking about. Should I be concerned about that? Or is it just like, yeah, Bill, we get it. We're ready to go. Reassure me.
I'm feeling pretty good about it.
Okay. All right. Okay. If you think you've got this wired, okay, and then you suddenly think sometime before Sunday, you know what? I still don't get this liberal internationalism thing or something like that. I can't make sense of this. I thought when I read this, I understood it. I went back and I couldn't get it. Sooner rather than later, fire off an email to me. We'll set up a Zoom time. I'll explain it to you as best I can. Okay, at least so that you can, you know, you can function in the assignment. I don't want you to think that I'm with these assignments that I'm just cutting you loose. Okay, I mean, ultimately the work has to be yours, but you know, my job is to give you the opportunity to present me with your best work. So if you think you've got it right now, and then you realize 3 hours or 2 days later, I don't understand this, that's okay. But just make sure you get a hold of me so that I can be of some use to you. Okay? Anything else? All right, then my work here is done and so is yours.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.